I keep replaying the whole sequence in my mind late at night when the apartment is too quiet and the street noise from below filters in like distant reminders that the world keeps moving, even if I'm stuck here questioning everything, trying to trace back to the exact moment when what felt like a normal new start in a foreign city began unraveling into this persistent knot of doubt and unease that tightens every time I think about her, making me wonder if I'm losing my grip or if there's something genuinely off that I've been too willing to ignore because being alone felt worse. It was about 6 months ago now that I made the move to Amsterdam for the logistics job, packing up my life from a comfortable but stagnant routine in a Midwestern town where the days blurred together with the same commutes and weekend barbecues, swapping it for this vibrant mess of a city where the canals reflect everything in distorted ways and the constant flow of bikes and tourists makes you feel both connected and utterly anonymous at the same time. The company had set me up in a compact studio in De Pijp, with its tall, narrow windows looking out over a patchwork of rooftops and the occasional glimpse of people in their lit-up lives across the way. But those first weeks were rough, the kind where you unpack boxes slowly because rushing would mean admitting how empty the space feels without anyone to share it with. And I'd find myself scrolling through my phone at odd hours just to drown out the silence. At 34, it's not like I expected some grand reinvention, but the isolation hit harder than anticipated, especially with the language barrier creeping in during simple things like ordering coffee or chatting with neighbors who assumed I was just another short-term expat. People back home would text about how exciting it must be, how the dating scene there is so liberated with apps full of internationals looking for connections. But I wasn't drawn to the high-energy nights out at clubs pulsing with bass or the group bike rides that turned into impromptu parties. I wanted something steadier, so I stuck to the familiar ritual of opening Tinder or Bumble late in the evening, swiping through profiles while the rain pattered against the glass, hoping for a match that didn't feel forced. Lena's profile appeared one of those nights, and it stuck with me in a way that others didn't. Her main photo showing her alone at a cafe table with an untouched espresso and a paperback spread open, her dark hair tucked behind one ear, expression neutral but intent, like she was midway through a thought she didn't want interrupted. The bio was minimal, just looking for real talks in a place that never stops, which resonated because it echoed my own fatigue with the superficial chats that went nowhere. And even though I usually lean toward profiles with more details, hobbies listed out, maybe a sense of humor in the prompts, something about her direct gaze through the screen made me swipe right without overthinking. We matched almost immediately, and the conversation started casually that evening. Her asking about what brought me here, me explaining the job transfer and how the city felt overwhelming yet promising, and from there it built steadily over days into longer exchanges about books we'd read, the subtle cultural shifts that caught us off guard, the way Amsterdam's constant motion could make you feel invisible if you let it. She worked remotely as a translator for obscure literary works, mostly from Slavic languages into Dutch or English, which meant her schedule was flexible but solitary, holed up in her apartment near the Vondelpark with stacks of manuscripts and a view of joggers passing by. We shared complaints about the perpetual dampness seeping into everything, the overpriced groceries at the markets, and gradually it felt like we were syncing up, her responses coming at times when I needed the distraction most, pulling me out of the isolation without demanding too much in return. After 2 weeks of this back and forth, we arranged to meet at a quiet bar along the Prinsengracht, one with mismatched chairs and a bartender who didn't rush you, and when she walked in wearing a simple black coat over jeans, her presence was calmer than I'd imagined, her voice soft with a faint accent that hinted at time spent elsewhere. And we talked for hours about nothing and everything, the conversation flowing in a way that made the evening slip by unnoticed. Things progressed naturally from there, no big declarations or rushed commitments, just seeing each other a couple times a week at first, alternating between her place, a cozy one-bedroom filled with bookshelves that bowed under the weight of paperbacks and plants that trailed from every surface, the air always carrying a faint scent of herbal tea, and mine, where she'd comment on the bareness of the walls and suggest small ways to make it feel less temporary. We'd cook simple meals together, her chopping vegetables with a precision that came from years of living alone, me handling the stove while we discussed films or podcasts, and it felt grounding, like I'd found a pocket of stability amid the city's chaos. But about a month in, During one of those evenings at my studio when the rain was coming down hard outside, and we decided to stay in with wine and whatever was in the fridge, the first crack appeared in a way that I dismissed too quickly, letting it fade into the background because acknowledging it would have meant questioning the ease we'd built. We were on the couch, legs tangled under a blanket, talking about past relationships in that vague, careful manner new couples do, and she brought up an ex who'd been controlling, not in graphic detail, but enough that her tone shifted, a subtle tightness around her eyes as she described how he'd isolated her over time. I leaned in to say something reassuring, my hand reaching for hers, but right then the lamp in the corner began to hum, a low vibration that escalated into a discordant buzz echoing through the small space, and simultaneously the shadows on the walls seemed to deepen unnaturally, stretching toward the center of the room as if pulled by an unseen force, creating patterns that flickered just at the edge of perception. It went on longer than it should have, maybe 40 seconds of this oppressive distortion that made the air feel thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin until I had to fight the urge to stand up and check the wiring or open a window for relief. She sat there unmoved, her gaze fixed on a point across the room, and when it finally subsided, the light returning to its steady glow, she blinked slowly and continued as if nothing had interrupted, picking up the thread of her story without a pause. I told myself it was the building's old electrical system acting up in the storm, a common issue in these pre-war structures, and we finished the night curled together in bed. But lying there in the dark, I couldn't shake the residual tension, the way the incident had left me hyper-aware of every small sound in the apartment. As the weeks went by and we spent more time together, weaving small routines into our days, like sharing morning coffee on her balcony while watching the park slowly come alive with joggers and dog walkers, or taking evening strolls along the canals where the bridge lights shimmered and wavered on the dark water. We began to feel like a real part of each other's lives. Yet, gradually, I started to notice how her mood seemed to affect the atmosphere around us in subtle, inexplicable ways that planted a quiet unease I couldn't quite put into words, even to myself. There were moments when she would drift away mid-conversation, her eyes glazing over, as if she were listening to something distant that only she could hear, and in those instants my phone would glitch unexpectedly. Texts would hang forever before sending, the screen would flicker without reason, or the room would grow noticeably colder, a sudden chill settling over everything despite the heater humming steadily in the background. I told myself these were coincidences, that my own paranoia from adjusting to a new city was amplifying ordinary quirks into something more sinister, but the doubt lingered all the same. Then came the weekend we escaped to the Haute Veloue, craving a break from the urban noise. We packed snacks and books into the car, filled the drive with our shared playlist and easy banter about finally getting away from the tourist crowds. The park felt endless, with pine forests stretching in every direction and sandy paths crunching beneath our feet as we hiked for hours, pausing at scenic overlooks to catch our breath, her hand in mine providing a small but steady sense of connection amid the vast openness. That second night in the simple wooden cabin, with its porch facing directly into the woods, the day's physical exhaustion should have pulled me straight into sleep, but instead, I lay wide awake beside her, my body heavy, yet my mind racing through disjointed fragments, unanswered work emails, vague anxieties about renewing my lease, old arguments from past relationships resurfacing without warning. She slept peacefully, her breathing deep and even, so eventually I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and stepped onto the porch, letting the crisp night air, thick with the scent of earth and resin, wash over me while stars flickered through gaps in the canopy in a way the city lights never permitted. I sat there in the darkness, beginning to relax at last, until my eyes adjusted and I noticed a shape standing at the tree line about 50 meters away, taller than any person ought to be, its outline blurred yet unmistakably present, marked by two faint points of luminescence that remained fixed in my direction like unblinking eyes. It didn't move or advance, simply held its position on the periphery, but the longer I stared, the more it stirred a deep instinctive discomfort, a whispering uncertainty about what I was truly seeing, until my skin prickled and my pulse quickened, driving me to retreat inside where I bolted the door with hands that trembled faintly before sliding back into bed. Sleep finally came, but it was restless, haunted by the lingering sensation of being watched from just beyond the walls. The next morning, greeted by birdsong and soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, the whole experience felt diminished, almost dreamlike, and over our simple breakfast of instant coffee and bread, I meant to mention it casually, perhaps frame it as a humorous tale about wildlife or my imagination running wild in the unnatural quiet. But when I opened my mouth to speak, the words dissolved before they could form, a sudden dryness spreading through my throat as if I'd swallowed sand, leaving me sitting there mute while she talked cheerfully about the drive home. She noticed my hesitation, tilting her head with a gentle, concerned look, but I brushed it aside as nothing more than lingering fatigue from poor sleep, and we packed up and left without ever circling back to it. Though during the entire return trip I caught myself repeatedly checking the rearview mirror, half convinced I'd glimpsed that indistinct shape trailing us at a distance. Back in the city, our routine picked up again, with her staying over more often and leaving small traces of herself around my apartment. Her favorite mug in the cupboard, handwritten notes on the fridge about needed groceries, and it should have felt reassuring, this slow merging of our daily lives. Instead, the small anomalies kept accumulating, quietly eroding the sense of security beneath it all. Conversations where she would anticipate my thoughts with unsettling precision, finishing sentences I'd only half formed in my own mind. Evenings when a casual remark about someone who had irritated her at work was followed the next day by news of that person suddenly falling ill with vague, unexplained symptoms. Quiet moments alone in her apartment, when I'd sense a subtle pressure in the air, as though the space itself were watchful, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. I began to question my own mental stability, wondering whether the stresses of the move had unearthed old anxieties I thought I'd buried long ago, causing me to project imagined patterns onto an innocent relationship. But deeper down, the connections felt too consistent, too intrinsically tied to her, to dismiss outright. The breaking point arrived just a couple of weeks ago, on an ordinary Tuesday when we met after she'd finished a tight deadline, settling into a bistro near Wester Park with salads and beers amid the evening bustle. The conversation stayed light until a jogger brushed roughly past her chair without apology, jostling her drink and continuing on with a careless wave over his shoulder. I laughed it off, accustomed to the cramped chaos of city sidewalks, but she froze, her face paling as she whispered something indistinct under her breath, her fingers tightening around her glass until her knuckles went white. For the rest of the meal, she was distant, answering in monosyllables, her gaze drifting toward the windows where reflections danced and distorted in the glass. And when we parted early outside her building, her goodbye hug felt mechanical, almost detached, leaving me to walk home alone with a nagging worry that I'd somehow upset her. Sleep evaded me that night as my mind replayed the evening in endless loops, and the next morning, while sipping black coffee and idly scrolling local news on my laptop, a headline stopped me cold. A jogger discovered collapsed in the park overnight, no visible injuries yet unresponsive, his running route matching the path that would have taken him past our bistro. The article included photos from the scene, paramedics loading him onto a stretcher amid scattered leaves, and in one background shot, partially hidden by foliage, stood that same elongated form with its piercing reflective spots, positioned as though silently overseeing the aftermath, its presence triggering a wave of nausea that blurred my vision and spun the room into darkness. I came to hours later sprawled on the floor, head pounding, my phone buzzing insistently with missed work messages, and in that disoriented haze, the pieces finally locked together, the disturbances always circling her, responding to her unspoken frustrations in silent, insidious ways that protected or punished without leaving any concrete trace, only an expanding void where certainty used to be. I reached out to her right away, calls going straight to a voicemail greeting delivered in her eerily calm voice, texts remaining undelivered for days that stretched into a full week of oppressive silence. During that time, I paced my apartment endlessly, avoiding mirrors because my reflection appeared increasingly haggard and unfamiliar, as though the mounting doubt were visibly carving itself into my features. The city outside grew stifling, every shadow in the narrow alleyways a potential warning, every stranger's passing glance feeling like an extension of whatever unseen force clung to her, and I started varying my routes home, drawing curtains earlier each evening, leaving lights burning through the night to fend off the deepening sense of isolation that magnified every creak and whisper in the old building. Then, 2 nights ago, the message appeared without warning in the small hours, glowing on my screen in the darkness. "Meet me at my place tomorrow. We have to talk face to face." I stared at those words for what felt like hours, their quiet inevitability twisting in my stomach, forcing me to confront whether replying would fully invite whatever lurks at the edges into my life, or whether ignoring it merely condemns me to live forever under the half-light of uncertainty, bearing the psychological weight of never truly knowing if I'm alone, or if her influence, whatever it may be, has already taken permanent root inside me. The choice remains suspended, heavy, and unresolved, as I type this in the faint glow of my laptop while rain begins to fall again outside, wondering whether anyone else has experienced this gradual corrosion where affection slowly sours into fear, where the person you believed was your sanctuary becomes the quiet source of a dread that seeps into every unguarded moment, leaving you to question if escape is still possible or if the connections have grown too entangled to cut free without sacrificing part of yourself in the process. I keep thinking about how it all started so quietly, like nothing bad could come from just trying to fill the empty space in the house after she left. But now, it's all I can think about when I lie awake at night listening to the sounds from the other room, wondering if I should have listened to that little voice telling me to stay alone forever. I was 19 when I got involved with my first real boyfriend, and it lasted almost 3 years before everything fell apart in ways I didn't see coming at the time, starting with the small controls like who I could talk to or what I could wear, building up to the yelling and the bruises that I hid under long sleeves even in summer. When I finally walked away at 22, I had nothing left but a positive pregnancy test and a promise to myself that I'd never let another man get close enough to do that kind of damage again, because the fear of repeating it was stronger than any loneliness I might feel down the road. The only thing that made it worth it was my daughter, Lily, who came into the world screaming and perfect, and I poured everything into her, moving us into a subsidized apartment complex for single parents where the walls were thin but the neighbors looked out for each other, and I picked up a job as a medical receptionist at a local clinic, answering phones and scheduling appointments around her naps and feedings until she was old enough for daycare. Over the next few years, I juggled that job with night shifts at a diner and freelance data entry from home whenever I could squeeze it in, saving every extra dollar until we could afford a small 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but with a yard where Lily could play, and a kitchen big enough for us to bake cookies on rainy afternoons. My sister would call every week, pushing me to go out, meet someone, saying I was too young to close myself off like that. But I always shut it down because I had Lily to think about, and the last thing she needed was some guy coming in and messing up the stable life we'd built together. Plus, I met enough single dads at school events or playgrounds to know that most of them were just as broken as anyone else, carrying their own baggage that I didn't want tangled up with mine. We had our routine: school drop-offs, homework help, movie nights with popcorn, and it felt solid, like we didn't need anyone else to make it work. Even if some nights after she went to bed, I'd sit on the couch scrolling through old photos and wonder if I was missing out on something everyone else seemed to have. By the time Lily turned 18 and graduated high school, things had shifted in ways I hadn't expected, with her getting accepted to a university out in Oregon, clear across the country from our little spot in the Midwest. And the thought of her being that far away hit me harder than I let on, like the house would echo without her laughter or her music playing from her room. The week before, she packed up her car and drove off with a mix of excitement and tears. She sat me down at the kitchen table one evening after dinner, pushing aside the plates of leftover pasta we'd made together, and looked at me with that serious expression she gets when she's about to say something she's been rehearsing in her head. She told me she knew how hard it had been for me raising her alone, how I'd put everything on hold, and now that she was starting her own life, she didn't want me rattling around by myself. That maybe it was time to try dating again, just to have someone to share coffee with or go to a movie. I brushed it off at first, saying I was fine, that work kept me busy and I had friends from the clinic to grab lunch with, but she kept at it, talking about how apps made it easy these days, how I could control who I talked to and take it slow. After about an hour of her insisting, with that mix of concern and stubbornness she got from me, I gave in, mostly to make her feel better before she left. And we sat there on the couch with her laptop setting up a profile on one of those sites, uploading a recent photo from her graduation party, filling in details about my age, my job, what I liked, reading mysteries, walking in the park, quiet evenings, and what I didn't, like crowds or loud music. It felt exposing, putting all that out there for strangers to judge, but Lily assured me it was standard, that the algorithm would handle the matching, and it might take a bit. Sure enough, about 10 days after she left, with the house feeling emptier than ever and me eating dinners alone in front of the TV, the app notified me of a match. His name was Robert, 43 like me, with a profile photo showing him in a button-down shirt standing by a lake, brown hair neatly trimmed, a soft smile that didn't seem forced. We started messaging that evening, casual stuff about our days. He worked as an accountant for a small firm, lived in a suburb about 30 miles away. And it flowed easily, no pressure, just getting to know each other through texts about favorite books or weekend plans. After a few days, he suggested meeting for coffee at a neutral spot downtown, and I agreed, figuring it was low stakes, easy to leave if it felt off. That Saturday, I drove over, parked in the lot, and walked in to find him already at a table with 2 mugs waiting, standing up to greet me with a handshake that lingered just a second too long, but not in a bad way. He was taller than I'd pictured, with kind eyes and a quiet voice, and we talked for over an hour about our kids. His daughter was 21, studying nursing nearby, and shared interests like hiking trails we'd both been to and old bands from the 80s. When we parted ways, he asked if I'd like to do dinner sometime, and I said yes without overthinking it, driving home feeling a cautious optimism I hadn't expected, like maybe opening up a little wasn't the end of the world. The first real date was at an Italian place midway between us. Nothing too fancy but with good reviews, and I spent the afternoon picking out a simple dress from the back of my closet, something I hadn't worn in years, telling myself it was just dinner, no big deal. He was there when I arrived, holding the door open, and we settled into a booth where the conversation picked up right where the coffee left off, talking about work frustrations, his long hours during tax season, my dealing with difficult patients, and family stories, like how Lily called every other day to check in from campus. He paid the bill without making a show of it, walked me to my car, and gave me a quick hug goodbye, saying he'd text soon about getting together again. I drove home replaying the evening, noticing how comfortable it had felt, how he listened without interrupting, and for the first time in decades I let myself imagine what it might be like to have someone around regularly, not to replace what I had with Lily, but to add to it in small ways. A few days later, he actually called, not texted, asking if I'd come over to his place for dinner the following Thursday, saying he enjoyed cooking and wanted to make his specialty, a homemade stir-fry with fresh vegetables from the market. He mentioned his daughter might be home that night, that it'd be nice for me to meet her if she was around, and I didn't see any red flags, figuring it was a step forward but still casual, so I said sure, and got the address. The drive took about 40 minutes, through quieter roads leading to his neighborhood of modest, split-level homes. His painted a faded blue with a well-kept lawn and lights on in every window like he was making sure I couldn't miss it. I parked on the street and walked up, knocking lightly, and his daughter answered, a young woman with his same brown hair and easy smile, introducing herself as Megan and leading me inside with a polite hello. The house smelled strongly of cleaner, like lemon-scented disinfectant that hit you right away. And as we walked through the living room to the kitchen, I noticed the hardwood floors looked worn, scuffed in places with faint marks that didn't quite shine despite the obvious effort to clean them. Robert came around the corner from the stove, wiping his hands on a towel, greeting me with a kiss on the cheek that felt warm but brief, and gestured for me to sit at the table where Megan was already pouring glasses of iced tea. We chatted while he finished cooking, Megan talking about her classes, how she was balancing school with a part-time job at a bookstore, and it all seemed normal, though she kept glancing at me with questions about my work, my daughter, in a way that felt a bit probing but nothing out of the ordinary for meeting someone new. Robert served the food, plates of stir-fry with rice that tasted fresh and well-seasoned, and we ate together, the conversation light until Megan asked if I was serious about dating her dad, phrasing it bluntly enough that I paused mid-bite, saying we were just getting to know each other. She nodded, then commented on how he'd mentioned my smile from the profile photo, how it stood out, and I thanked her awkwardly, sipping my tea, which had a slightly bitter aftertaste I chalked up to the brand. Robert stayed quiet during most of that, focused on his plate, and soon after I started feeling heavy, like the long day at work was catching up, my eyelids drooping despite it being early evening. I excused myself to the bathroom down the hall, splashed water on my face, But when I came back, everything blurred, and the last thing I remember is trying to say I needed to go home before the room tilted and went dark. When I came to, it was pitch black around me, with that sharp lemon cleaner smell thicker than before, clinging to everything, and I could hear muffled voices upstairs, footsteps pacing across what must have been the kitchen floor. My head throbbed, mouth dry, but my arms and legs weren't restrained, so I sat up slowly, feeling around on the cold concrete until my hands hit walls, shelves lined with boxes and tools, realizing I was in the basement. Anger hit first, hot and immediate because I'd let my guard down after all these years, trusted someone who turned out to be just as manipulative as the last, drugging me and locking me down here for whatever reason his twisted mind had come up with. I didn't panic or yell, just stood quietly, mapping the space with my hands until I found a utility light clipped to a shelf, switching it on to scan the room. Bare walls, old furniture pushed to the sides, and stairs leading up to a door that was probably locked. As I turned the beam around, it caught on something in the far corner, a large plastic tub on wheels, smeared with dark streaks that looked like dried rust at first, but up close were clearly blood, crusted along the edges, and inside were shapes wrapped in stained sheets, lumpy and irregular. I pulled back a corner carefully, the smell hitting me like rot mixed with chemicals, revealing pale limbs, a woman's arm, a section of torso with skin mottled and cut clean, and higher up, a head with empty sockets where eyes should be, hair matted and dull. The realization settled in slow, that this wasn't random, that Robert and maybe Megan were involved in something far worse than I imagined, collecting parts like some deranged project, and the thought of my own features being eyed for addition made me retch into the corner, wiping my mouth and forcing myself to breathe steady. I grabbed a heavy crowbar from a nearby workbench, gripping it tight as I waited in the shadows by the stairs, hours passing until the door creaked open and Megan descended, humming softly like nothing was wrong. I swung hard when she reached the bottom, connecting with a dull thud that dropped her silent to the floor, blood pooling quick around her head. I stepped over her, climbed up quietly into the empty kitchen, and moved through the house until I found Robert in the living room, dozing in an armchair with the TV on low. I had time to gather rope from the garage, tape from a drawer, binding him before he fully woke, dragging him back down to the basement where I secured him to a support beam, ignoring his groggy pleas as I confronted him about the tub, about what he'd been doing. He broke down eventually, admitting he'd been piecing together what he called his ideal companion, taking what he liked from women he'd lured in over the years, because no one whole ever measured up to his vision, starting small and escalating when they didn't fit. I made him watch as I hauled the parts upstairs in bags, dousing them with lighter fluid in the backyard and setting them ablaze, the smoke curling up while he sobbed from the basement doorway, begging for it to stop. It's been 3 months now, and Robert's still with me, moved into the spare room of my apartment where I've reinforced the door and added chains to the walls to keep him from wandering off, because after everything I realized, I don't want to be alone anymore, and he's the one who started this, so he can stay and fill the silence. The walls are insulated now, thick enough that his occasional shouts don't carry to the neighbors, usually when I remind him of Megan, how her absence is on him for pulling me into their mess. I tell him stories about Lily, how she'll be home for spring break soon, excited to meet the new man in my life, though I haven't decided yet if I'll introduce him properly or just let her see how well we've adjusted. He cries then. But it's his fault. All of it. And in a way it's comforting knowing he'll never leave, never hurt me like the others tried. If you're thinking about dating after being alone so long, just remember how easy it is for things to twist, how one small step can lock you into something permanent. I'm not quite sure why I'm writing this now, but the words are flowing, and I fear that if I stop typing, I'll just end up staring at the screen, spiraling back into my thoughts. Perhaps getting it all down in one go will help quiet the noise for a little while. It's been nearly 3 months since everything began, and each night I replay that moment in my mind, searching for the exact point where I should have turned back. At the time, everything felt so normal that I didn't realize something was off. It all started after the breakup with Sarah. The end of our 4-year relationship left me with something I could grasp without it weighing me down every second of the day. We had lived together for 3 years, and when it ended, it wasn't marked by a single explosive moment or betrayal. We simply drifted apart, two people sharing space rather than a life. I moved with friends into a small third-floor apartment downtown, complete with creaky hardwood floors and windows facing a brick wall across the alley. Initially, the place felt like a fresh start, even if the quiet took some getting used to. After a couple of weeks spent unpacking and rearranging the same furniture, I grew weary of the silence that accompanied the nightly clanks of the radiator and the muffled arguments of neighbors through the walls. So, I re-downloaded the dating apps, not because I was eager to find something serious, but because I craved conversation, the feeling of belonging rather than simply orbiting the edges of life. That's how I found Claire. Her profile stood out amidst the usual filtered photos and clever prompts. She had 3 pictures, one of her sitting on the front steps of a house in soft afternoon light, her dark hair pulled back, wearing a well-loved green sweater, another at a farmer's market, laughing at something off camera while holding a paper cup of coffee, and a close-up of her eyes and half a smile that felt intimate without trying too hard. Her bio was a single line: trying to be better at meeting people in real life, failing. It struck me as honest, as if she wasn't playing to an algorithm, so I swiped right. When we matched that evening, I sent a simple message about how her bio resonated with me. She replied within minutes with a dry, self-deprecating comment that set the tone for our conversation. Over the next few days, we exchanged emails about everything from favorite records to overpriced downtown coffee shops. Our discussions deepened, touching on jobs, family, and the little frustrations of navigating our 30s. Claire worked as a freelance graphic designer, living in a small town about 40 minutes away. She spent her weekends fixing up an old house she'd bought for a steal, while I shared tales of my web development job, mundane bug fixes and client revisions that paid the rent but didn't ignite any passion. Claire's follow-up questions showed she was genuinely listening, keeping our conversation vibrant and engaging. A week later, she suggested we move off the app and exchanged phone numbers. Her texts were constant but never overwhelming, just enough to look forward to without the anxiety of waiting for a reply. She sent me pictures of her house as she made progress: new paint in the kitchen, shelves crafted from salvaged lumber, and I responded with sunset shots from my balcony and quirky finds from the record store. One evening, she called out of the blue while driving home from the grocery store, expressing her fatigue with podcasts and her desire for a real conversation. We talked for nearly 2 hours about everything from our parents to past relationships and how certain songs take on new meanings as life unfolds. Her voice had a low, slightly raspy edge, reminiscent of someone who had smoked for a few years and then quit. After we hung up, I found myself replaying parts of our conversation. When she suggested meeting in person, it felt perfectly timed. She chose a quiet bar halfway between us, the kind with dark wood booths and a solid beer list, and we set it for a Friday night when neither of us had plans. I arrived early, ordered a drink to calm my nerves, and when she walked in a few minutes late, she spotted me, waved, and offered an apologetic smile as she crossed the room. In person, she was a bit more reserved than on the phone, but it suited her. She listened intently and responded thoughtfully, filling the silences with meaningful exchanges. We stayed until the bartender began tucking away chairs, discussing books, travel, and all the little things that make a city feel like home. In the parking lot, she hugged me longer than I expected before pulling back and saying she'd text me when she got home safely. 20 minutes later, I received a simple message: "Still smiling. Thanks for tonight." Our second date was at her place. She invited me over, offering to cook dinner and using the new kitchen paint as an excuse to stay in. I brought a bottle of wine she mentioned liking, and when I arrived, she gave me a quick tour of the house, pointing out the original hardwood floors she had refinished and the built-in bookshelves overflowing with paperbacks and plants on every windowsill. We cooked together in the narrow kitchen, moving around each other with ease, laughing as the sauce splattered on the stove. After dinner, we opened a second bottle and sat on her couch, chatting until the early hours, drifting from funny work stories to quieter admissions about past relationships and what we were looking for now. At one point, she fell asleep against my shoulder, and I remained still for a long time, listening to her breathe and savoring the warmth of her presence, realizing how quickly this was beginning to feel real. As time passed, I started spending most weekends at her place. She cleared out a drawer without a word, and I left a toothbrush and a change of clothes. We talked about modest future plans, upcoming spring concerts, and possibly a drive to the coast when the weather turned. When she met a couple of my friends passing through town, it felt natural, just as it did when one of her friends dropped by unexpectedly one afternoon. Everything felt balanced and easy in a way I hadn't anticipated so soon after the breakup. Then, the first thing that didn't make sense occurred. One weekend morning, I woke up before her and went to make coffee. In my search for mugs, I opened the wrong cabinet and discovered a neat stack of printed photographs. Dozens of them, all of me. Some were obvious screenshots from my Instagram stories from months before we matched, while others were taken from a distance. Me walking into my apartment carrying groceries, me filling my car at the gas station near work, me perched on my balcony with a beer watching the street below. None of the photos felt overtly threatening, but they were clearly taken over a span of weeks, perhaps even months. I stood there holding the stack, trying to rationalize it. Maybe she had been curious before we met, wanting to see what I looked like in real life rather than through curated photographs. Even that felt like a stretch. When she eventually wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes, I slid the photos back into the cabinet, smiled as if everything was fine, and handed her a mug. I didn't mention it that weekend or the next, convincing myself that when people are interested, they do strange things, and that I was simply overthinking it after being alone for too long. A few weeks after that, I started to notice something unsettling. Whenever she texted, she would lean her phone away from me, just enough that I couldn't catch a glimpse of the screen. I'd never been the type to snoop on a partner's messages, but it gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew things I hadn't shared, like the gym I'd switched to or the exact Thai place I'd mentioned wanting to try. She even named the restaurant on 8th with the red awning before I'd specified it. She never asked to follow me on social media or suggested I post anything about our relationship. When I casually mentioned it, she told me she preferred to keep things private and didn't like to broadcast her life online. Then came the work trip, a 2-day conference a couple of hours away. She seemed fine with it, even helping me pack the night before. We spent that evening talking and having dinner in my apartment until late, and when she left early the next morning for a client project, she left a sweet note saying she'd miss me and to drive safely. It felt like I was doing everything right for her. After a long day of sessions at the conference, I texted her from the hotel that evening, but she didn't reply until the next morning. Her message was upbeat, asking how the talks were going and telling me to call when I had a break. I called her during lunch and she sounded perfectly normal, asking specific questions about the speakers and mentioning how overwhelmed she was with deadlines. When I hung up, I noticed my phone battery was lower than I expected, despite charging it overnight. On a whim, I opened Find My Friends, something I hadn't done in ages, and saw her location listed in the same tab. The dot showed she was at the conference hotel. I had no memory of adding her name or giving consent. Staring at the screen in the hotel lobby, a wave of unease washed over me, the kind that doesn't just fade away with a laugh. That night, sleep eluded me. I replayed the timeline in my head, wondering how long she'd been paying attention to me before we even met. Had our easy conversation and instant connection been built on something I hadn't even recognized yet? I went to my laptop, searched her name, and found little. Just a couple of links to a freelance portfolio with no photos, and her house address registered under some anonymous trust instead of her name. I convinced myself I was spiraling, telling myself that new relationships make everyone a bit paranoid. I promised I'd talk to her calmly when I returned, clear the air like adults. When I drove home late Sunday night, exhausted from the conference and my racing thoughts, everything seemed normal at first glance. But the mail on the counter was neatly organized into piles, unlike the usual mess I left behind, and one of the bedroom drawers was slightly ajar. It was as if someone had been in my space while I was away. Claire texted me first thing Monday, asking if I made it home safely and saying she missed me. I replied that work had worn me out, but we could meet up on Thursday if she didn't have a deadline earlier in the week. The next couple of days dragged on as I went through the motions at the office, jumping each time my phone buzzed, making extra trips home, wondering if I was imagining things. On Wednesday night, I went out for drinks with friends, and when I returned to my apartment, Claire sent me a text with a new photo attached. My building at night, taken from the street across the way, my windows lit up. The message simply said, "Thinking about you." That night, I sat on my couch, surrounded by bright lights, listening for footsteps in the hall. When I finally heard slow steps stop outside my door around 3, I held my breath until they faded away. The next day, I packed a bag and drove to my brother's apartment a couple of hours away, telling him I needed a change of scenery for a few days. I turned my phone off completely for the first time in ages, hoping that some distance would help me figure out if I was overreacting. I left it off for 3 whole days, but when I finally turned it back on, my heart sank. There were 17 missed calls and over 30 texts from Claire. The first few were casual check-ins, then they turned more worried, and soon enough, it was just my name repeated over and over. I played one voicemail over the speaker while my brother was in the other room. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, acknowledging that I needed space but insisting we should talk soon. That afternoon, I blocked her number and deleted the apps, changing my locks even though she never had a key. I stopped posting online, switched up my parking spots, took the stairs instead of the elevator, and changed my habits, trying to convince myself I was safe. For a while, it seemed to work. The silence felt like she'd stepped back. But 2 nights ago, I woke up needing water and headed to the kitchen. As I fumbled in the dark, I pulled my phone from the nightstand, and the screen lit up with a notification, though I hadn't even touched it. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize, no words, just a photo attachment that slowly revealed itself in the dim light. It was a shot of my bedroom from the corner by the closet, me sleeping on my back, one arm dangling over the edge, time-stamped just 3 minutes earlier. I haven't returned to my apartment since. Now, I'm bouncing between motels and friends' couches, paying in cash whenever I can, trying to think of somewhere she doesn't know about. I keep going back to how normal everything felt at the start, how easy it was to let someone in when you're tired of being alone. But now, I have no idea how long she was watching before she sent that first message or what her next move will be. All I know is that wherever I go next, she may already have the address. If you use dating apps, just be careful. People can seem perfect and fit into the spaces you didn't even know were empty, and sometimes they've been studying those spaces for a lot longer than you think. I encountered him on Tinder last September when everyone was starting to complain about how fast summer had gone and the leaves in Chicago's streets began to change color thanks to the trees. Alex was 35 years old. His profile stated that he worked at a medical supply company in sales. He said he traveled for demonstrations and meetings, but mainly worked out of Chicago most of the time. His pictures were plain, unedited, and without flair. One picture showed him in a button-down shirt and tie at what looked like a trade booth. He described his hobbies in shorthand, just saying that he enjoyed all the local venues for live music and liked a good glass of whiskey now and then, hoping to find someone to tag along for an adventure. I am 28. I had been out of a relationship for about 8 months after it seemed to end with a guy who hadn't responded after my most recent encounter. This had made me doubt everything I said or did in the weeks before, and made me hesitant to jump into a relationship too quickly. I swiped right on Alex because he seemed stable, having a real job instead of being someone who might enjoy playing games. When I messaged him about the band logo on his t-shirt and one of his photos, he replied within an hour, saying he'd seen shows close to home lately and had none of the band's favorites. We continued texting back and forth for a few days after that. Nothing too intense or constant, just steady enough that it didn't feel like he was just pulling me along. We talked about some local acts we had both seen at spots like the Empty Bottle in Lincoln Hall, how openers were always a bummer but worth sticking around to see the headliners. When I mentioned my age, he told me to listen to a playlist of sorts, some indie rock, not so simple songs, and Tom Petty, who he said he listened to on long car rides to work. Midweek, he wanted to know if I wanted to get drinks Thursday night, and I said yes, as it was a low commitment if it didn't click. He mentioned a rooftop bar in Wicker Park with good reviews online, one with string lights hanging over picnic tables and a view of the skyline if you sat in the right place. When I got there, He was already sitting at a corner table with a drink in front of him. He got up and shared a hug that didn't last too long, and he looked very much like his photos, clean-shaven, with short dark hair, and a casual button-up shirt over jeans. He ordered a whiskey on the rocks. I got a glass of red wine, and we started talking about our jobs immediately. He explained a little more about his sales role, driving to cities like Milwaukee or Indianapolis to present things like IV stands or monitoring devices to hospital admins, saying it was enough money to cover the miles but got monotonous when working alone so much. I recounted my marketing work for a small agency where I managed social media campaigns and email blasts for retail clients, mostly from home nowadays, with rare office days for team get-togethers that never ended up running too long. He asked specific questions about what a normal day would be like for me, nodded along without interrupting, and when I told him a story I'd shared about a client who kept changing his mind on ad copy, often at the last minute, he laughed and said he had experienced similar indecisive buyers in his line of work. We felt a bit uncomfortable at first, but after our initial try, we finally moved to walk a few blocks to a taco truck he'd heard was good. We ordered a couple of al pastor tacos and sat on a bench a block away, eating while people walked by on the sidewalk. He insisted on paying without making it awkward. When it was getting late, he walked me to the L station, kissed me lightly on the mouth but didn't push for more, then texted about half an hour later to confirm I had made it home, telling me that he'd had a good time and wanted to do it again soon. The second date was the following Friday, and he offered to pick me up from my apartment, which was far away in Logan Square, at an Italian restaurant known for its checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles that he had said were praised for their pasta dishes. His car was a black SUV, a new model outfitted with leather seats, and that new car smell still lingering inside, clean without anything getting worn in the cup holders or floor mats. The dinner was relaxed. We split a bottle of Cabernet and an appetizer of bruschetta, and the conversation shifted to things resembling who we were. He told me about growing up in the northwest suburbs with parents who split when he was in high school, making him the only kid hopping between houses, and how that had taught him to fend for himself at a young age. I shared secrets about my family still living in a small town in southern Wisconsin. I had immediately moved to Chicago on the heels of college to start my career, making my life here without much assistance from them, visiting a few times a year to celebrate holidays but managing rent and bills myself. He said he admired the kind of people who stood on their own like that, noting that too many people depended too much on others the way they do now, which felt like a compliment, albeit not an extravagant one. After we finished the main courses, he suggested we walk to a nearby jazz club he had looked up. While we sat at a pretty little table near the back, listening to the band play standards, his hand would rest on my thigh under the table sometimes, not aggressive, but present. When the set ended, he drove me home, parked outside my building, and we made out in the front seat for a while, his hands mostly staying over my clothes, and when I pulled back, he didn't say anything, simply saying he was looking forward to when he saw me next. After that, his texts became more affectionate, like good morning messages with questions about my sleep or what I had planned for the day. He would share things about his road trips, the bad hotel breakfasts, or delays in traffic. On the third date, he suggested something for the weekend, saying he had a short work trip to Milwaukee on Friday, but could come back by Saturday morning if I was happy to do brunch and spend the day together. I thought it was fine, no commitment, so I said yes. He showed up at my apartment that Saturday with a bag of high-quality bagels and cream cheese from a bakery he said was the best in the city for that kind of stuff. I have a run-of-the-mill one-bedroom in Ukrainian village. Nothing fancy, with white walls and used furniture. A cat named Luna, who generally lives off the people who wouldn't notice her, but she peeked out from a hole under the sofa this time. He looked around without commenting, said the prints I had on the walls from local artists were cool, and we were at the little kitchen table, chatting about places we had been. He opened his phone to display pictures from a work trip to Prague a year ago, the Charles Bridge at night, and some old churches, then showed me ones from Rome with the Colosseum and pasta plates, noting that he had gone to a few European conferences and always included extra days to sightsee, saying it would be better if he could visit with somebody else next time. We wandered the neighborhood that afternoon for iced coffees at a corner shop, stumbled into a vintage store where he bought me a tiny necklace I liked but wasn't planning to buy, and ended up back at my place watching a documentary on music festivals that neither of us paid much attention to. Things got physical on the couch. Kisses turned into hands wandering, and I had to take it slower before I took off my clothes completely. He was okay with it, saying he would wait until I was ready. He slept most of the night in my bed, then got up first in the morning to make scrambled eggs with what I had in the fridge, cooking them plain like I usually do without telling him, and we ate in bed while scrolling through our phones. He left by noon, saying he had some work emails to catch up on but would call later. From that point on, the communication escalated significantly. Texts became a daily standard, and he would call a couple of nights a week to ask how things were going, relaying tales from his sales calls, like a hospital buyer negotiating every cent or someone experiencing a demo gone wrong when a piece of equipment broke down. One Tuesday, he sent flowers to my workplace, a bouquet of mixed wildflowers accompanied by a card that read, "Thinking of you during a long drive." My coworkers noticed when they arrived, and they began asking who he was and whether things were getting serious. I laughed it off, but I felt good knowing that he was genuinely putting in the effort rather than just putting on a show. For our fourth date, he wanted to do something different. He mentioned that a friend owned a boat anchored at the marina south of downtown and suggested we go on a sunset cruise on Lake Michigan, packing a picnic dinner to keep it low-key. I had never been on a private boat like that, so I agreed, thrilled at the idea. He picked me up on Friday night with a cooler in the back of his SUV filled with sandwiches, cheese, fruit, and a bottle of Prosecco. The marina was more crowded than I had anticipated, with people unloading equipment from their cars, but his friend's boat was tied up at the end of the pier. It was a white cabin cruiser about 30 feet long, featuring a small deck and steps leading down to a living area below, which included a mini kitchen and a bed in the back. Although his friend wasn't there, he explained that it was a last-minute arrangement. The keys were left under the mat, as if they had set it up for us. We loaded up and took off as the sun sank, with the water flat and the urban architecture glowing orange in the light. We ate while sitting on bench seats, drinking from plastic cups since glass wasn't allowed, and discussed how peaceful it was there, away from the noise. He said he could see more nights like this in our future, that I fit right into his life, and I agreed. It did feel natural. Once it got cooler, we went into the cabin below. We sat on the cushions, and things progressed to making out, our hands exploring one another. However, before it went any further, I held back and told him, "Not on a boat for the first time." He smiled and said, "No problem," and we just talked and relaxed until it was time to return to the dock around midnight. Afterward, instead of dropping me off at home, he drove us to his condo, saying it was closer and we could enjoy a nightcap with a view. Since it was late, I agreed. His place was on the 15th floor of a modern high-rise in River North. The building had a doorman who nodded as we walked in. The apartment itself was spacious, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river and city lights, minimalist furniture like a gray couch and a glass coffee table, and a kitchen with barely used stainless appliances. He mentioned he had bought it the previous year after doing well in commission, but hadn't bothered with much decor since he traveled so frequently. It only had the basics and a couple of framed family photos on a shelf. We had a glass of wine on the couch, casually discussing various topics, including our favorite childhood vacations, and eventually ended up in his bedroom, where things progressed further this time, slowly and carefully, with him checking in to make sure I was comfortable. In the morning, he ordered breakfast delivery through an app, bagels, lox, and coffee. We ate at the kitchen island while he checked work emails on his screen. Later in the morning, he drove me home, kissed me in the car, and told me he would be busy for the next few days with calls, but that I could text him anytime. That's when the shift began. Subtle at first, but gradually building in a way that made me wonder if I was reading too much into it. The texts arrived more frequently, not just in the mornings and evenings, but every couple of hours during the day. He would ask what I was working on, if I had eaten lunch, and what I wanted to do after work. If I didn't reply in the usual way, like during a meeting, he would follow up with messages like, "All right? Miss you already." He suggested we turn on location sharing on our phones, explaining that it was because he was on the road so much and wanted to know if I was home or out running errands. He would do the same, so I could see when he was stuck in traffic. I thought it was thoughtful and agreed to set it up that afternoon. I even texted him when I stopped at the coffee shop by my office, asking what I ordered, or if I took a detour to the store after work, inquiring if I needed him to pick something up on his way over. One evening, I was out with a couple of girlfriends at a bar in Wrigleyville for happy hour, which I had mentioned to him that morning. Halfway through the evening, he texted to ask how it was going, who was there, and if any guys had joined our group. I replied that it was just us girls having fun, and he responded, "Okay, be safe. Text me when you're heading home." A week after the boat date, he wanted to plan another weekend getaway. He mentioned that his family had a lake house in Wisconsin that was empty this time of year, about a 3-hour drive, and suggested we could go up Friday night after work and come back Sunday evening. I hesitated a little, feeling that it was a big step too soon, but he assured me it would be relaxing, with no responsibilities, just us and the water. I figured we could get out of the city. He picked me up with my bag packed and the drive was straightforward on the interstate. We talked the whole way about work, me venting about a client who kept sending revisions at midnight and him sharing stories about long sales meetings where buyers nitpicked prices. The house was located off a country road, a 2-story building with wood siding set back from the lake with a dock and a small boat tied up, and no other houses visible between the trees. Inside, it was cozy, featuring an open living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen stocked with the basics, and bedrooms upstairs. That first night, he grilled steaks on the deck, opened a bottle of red wine he had brought, and we dined at a picnic table while watching the water lap against the shore. After dinner, we sat next to the fire he had built in the pit, chatting about longer-term plans. He mentioned that he could see himself settling down in the next couple of years and having kids if he ever found the right person. He liked that we seemed to balance each other. Although it felt a bit rushed for that kind of talk, the wine made it easy to go along with it, and I admitted that I wanted those things eventually too. That night, we slept in the main bedroom, and everything went well. He was gentle and frequently checked in to make sure I was comfortable. On Saturday morning, we enjoyed coffee on the deck before he motored the boat to a cove where we anchored and swam in the cold water, lying on towels to dry in the sun. He took photos on his phone, complimented me on how incredible I looked, and sent a couple of the photos to me later. Back at the house that evening, we enjoyed more drinks and snacks before ending up in bed again. As I was packing my bag on Sunday, he took a call outside on the deck. I could hear fragments of his conversation through the open window, and he said in a low voice, "Yeah, she's here now. Fits the profile. We can bring it up next weekend if all goes smoothly." It turned out to be work-related, a deal or a client, but I didn't think much of it. The drive back was quieter as he checked his phone at stops, but he dropped me off with a kiss and said he'd call soon. From that point onward, the texts grew more insistent. He began telling me he loved me when he texted, saying he missed me when we were apart and expressing a desire to see me every day. It felt a bit rushed, but I played along. To avoid any conflict, he suggested a trip, mentioning a work conference in Vegas coming up the following month. He wanted me to come along and said the company occasionally covered extra expenses for companions, promising to handle my travel. I said I would check my work schedule, but that it sounded fun. A week later, he unexpectedly showed up one evening for takeout, calling it a surprise dinner. I had to cancel plans with a friend because he had already arrived. He wanted to know more about my friend, what we were doing, and whether it was a guy or a girl. I started to share more about my whereabouts, saying things like, "I saw you at the dry cleaner. What were you picking up?" Or, "I saw you downtown for lunch. Who were you with?" One thing I noticed later, though, my spare key was missing from the drawer where I always keep it, right next to the junk mail and extra batteries. I searched for it several times, figuring I'd just left it somewhere in my apartment. Shortly after that, Alex mentioned it informally when we were on the phone. He said he'd taken it to make a copy for emergencies, in case I ever locked myself out or needed him to pick up something when I wasn't home. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just said okay, but it stuck in my head a bit. When I felt myself still a bit weak, my phone died one night while I was out with friends at a bar, completely black screen by the time I got home. When I plugged it in and it came back on, there were a ton of missed calls from him and several texts asking if I was safe, where I was, and why I hadn't answered. He called again once it came back online and said it was nice that the location sharing feature was still active since he could see I was at the bar and was under no circumstances traveling anywhere else. He kept pushing for the Vegas trip and said I should just book my time off work while he took care of the flight and hotel. No big deal. I said I had deadlines for the agency to meet and wouldn't be able to take those days off. He brushed it off, insisting that we were building something real and that it would be good for us. Then he invited me back over for a different weekend at the lake house, mentioning that a couple of his friends would be coming so I could meet them. When we arrived, he was already home with two men, both in their mid-40s, who introduced themselves as business associates from out of state working with him on the import side of medical supplies. They were quiet and didn't say much right away. All they really did was watch me while we sat around the fire pit that night drinking beers. The conversation remained fuzzy. It mostly revolved around international medical devices, shipping delays, and having strong connections for big conferences in places like Vegas. One guy mentioned that he knew women working side gigs at these events, essentially hosting clients, going to dinners or shows, and making a little extra money on weekends. Alex nodded, saying it was a great opportunity for the right individual. I slept with Alex in the bedroom that night. The following morning, he and the other guys left early, saying they had to head back for flights. When it was just us, Alex started explaining that I could quit my job if I wanted and travel with him full-time now, as he made enough for both of us. I told him no. I actually enjoyed my job and the people around me. He told me to consider it anyway, saying I could help him with work occasionally, meet some of his contacts, and there was easy money in it. On our return to the city, I found myself slowing down my texts and responding later or with shorter replies. He picked up on it immediately and began calling more, asking where I was, whom I was with, and why I hadn't answered. 2 weeks later, he invited me out to his house for dinner. He picked me up, cooked salmon, and poured a lot of wine, keeping my glass refilled. We discussed making things exclusive and the idea of a future. I said yes. That felt right. We ended up in the bedroom and had sex again. Later, while we were just relaxing, he mentioned that some of his friends in Vegas ran a service for those big conferences, girls taking clients to dinners, parties, plays, and sometimes staying the night if it went that way. They got paid well, thousands for a weekend, more if it included everything, he said. He claimed it was all high-end, all safe, with only vetted rich guys involved, nothing shady. I asked him what he meant by all of it. It depended on the girl, but sex was involved if she was comfortable, and the tips were huge for that, he said. Totally controlled, with no genuine threat because they screened everyone. He said I was pretty and outgoing, perfect for it, and he'd help me meet the right people, guaranteeing I would work it out. He suggested I could do it once just to check it out. I told him that I wasn't interested. Not at all. He kept going, insisting it wasn't prostitution. It was high-class escorting, and girls did it full-time, getting nice apartments, cars, and trips paid for. No regular boss. I stood up, started getting dressed, and said I was leaving. He was blocking the doorway and said not to freak out, insisting it was just a bit of an idea that would help us financially down the line. I pushed him aside and called a ride home. That came right after the texts. Sorry if the timing was bad, he still wanted me, and we could have a good chat about it. I blocked his number, but then came the calls. From unknown numbers, voicemails asking if we should talk, that he missed me. Somehow, I noticed his car parked down the block from my apartment a couple of times. Just parked there. Location sharing was still activated. I'd forgotten to turn it off, and he texted about places I had been, like asking if I needed anything from the store. I changed the locks the next week, but I keep thinking he might have copied at least the key before that time. A friend told me he called her online, asking if I had said anything about him and if I sounded okay. I repeat to myself that he won't hurt me. He's just pushy and upset, but I'm stressed out. I think about those guys at the house, the phone call I overheard, and how Vegas was probably the whole plan. I tell myself that I am now safe, but I check the doors nonstop. I remind myself that he knows my address, my work schedule, my routine. I type this on a library computer because my phone stays off most of the time. I repeat that he'll stop eventually, but I know he has the network and the money, and he's not going to stop. I tell myself that I'm safe, but I am stressed, and I repeat it again. I matched with Sarah on Bumble back in late August last year. When the weather was still warm enough during the day that you'd sweat walking a couple blocks, but the nights had that chill creeping in where you'd grab a hoodie if you were heading out after dark. She was 31, worked as a project coordinator for some nonprofit organization downtown that focused on community outreach and grant applications, though we never really dove deep into the specifics of her job because the early conversations stayed pretty surface level and casual. Her profile pictures were the kind that didn't scream for attention, just her standing at a farmer's market stall with a canvas bag full of produce like peppers and tomatoes. Another one from what looked like an outdoor concert last summer with her in a crowd wearing sunglasses and a tank top, and a third where she was kneeling on a hiking trail petting her dog, a medium-sized brown mutt with floppy ears. Her bio was straightforward, no long paragraphs or emojis everywhere, just something about enjoying time outside, trying new food spots, and wanting to meet someone genuine who wasn't into games. I'm 34, had been single for about a year after a relationship that sort of petered out without any big arguments or anything dramatic. Just mutual realization that we weren't going anywhere long-term, and it left me not really motivated to date but still scrolling through apps on slow evenings. I sent the first message commenting on her dog because I have one too, a rescue named Max who's part lab and part who knows what, and she replied almost right away with a photo of her dog chasing after a stick in some park, asking what breed mine was. From there, the chat flowed easy. We swapped stories about good walking spots around the city that weren't too crowded on weekends, complained about how overpriced most coffee places had gotten lately with their fancy pour-overs, and avoided anything too personal like past relationships or family stuff right off the bat. It felt refreshing, no pressure, and by the end of that first week, we'd agreed to meet for brunch on Saturday at this cafe in Queen Anne that I knew had decent outdoor seating and wasn't usually packed. When I got there, she was already at a table outside under one of those big umbrellas, sipping black coffee and scrolling her phone, dressed in faded jeans and a simple gray t-shirt with a light jacket draped over the chair back. She looked exactly like her photos, maybe a touch more freckles across her nose from the summer sun, but she stood up when she saw me approaching and gave a quick hug that wasn't awkward or lingering. We ordered at the counter, scrambled eggs and toast for me, some kind of avocado smash on sourdough for her with a side of fruit, and sat talking about our weeks while waiting for the food to come out. Her job involved a lot of coordinating with volunteers and writing up reports for funders. Sounded busy but not overwhelming, and mine was the usual IT grind at a consulting firm, where I spent most days remotely troubleshooting why someone's email wasn't syncing or why a shared drive had gone offline again. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was actually paying attention, like what was the most ridiculous user error I'd dealt with recently, and I told her about this one manager who kept locking himself out of his account because he insisted on using the same password for everything and then forgetting the capitalization. She laughed in a way that wasn't forced, just a short, genuine chuckle, and shared a story about a donor at her work who once emailed a massive attachment that crashed their server. After we finished eating, we didn't rush to leave. Instead, walked down the street a bit to stretch it out. Ended up browsing this little independent bookstore where she picked up a paperback thriller about some missing person case, and I flipped through a couple magazines but didn't buy anything. When it was time to split, she said she'd had a good time and we should do it again soon. And I agreed without overthinking it. That night, she texted about how she was already a few chapters into the book and it was hooking her, and I replied with something about needing recommendations since I hadn't read much lately. The following week, we met up twice. First for a quick coffee after work on Wednesday, at a spot near her office downtown, where the line wasn't too long and we could sit outside watching people rush by on their commutes home. Conversation picked up right where we'd left off, talking about weekend plans and how the changing seasons made it harder to motivate for outdoor stuff when it got dark earlier. Then Friday, she invited me over for dinner at her place in Green Lake, said her roommate would be out visiting family so it'd be quiet. The apartment was on the second floor of an older building with creaky wooden stairs, and when she opened the door, the smell of garlic and herbs hit me right away. She'd made some kind of vegetable stir-fry with chicken, nothing fancy, but it looked good on the plates she had set out on the small kitchen table. The place was comfortable, not spotless, but lived in with a couch that had a throw blanket draped over it, a few houseplants on the windowsill that looked like they got regular water, dog bed in the corner with toys scattered around, and bookshelves crammed with paperbacks and a couple framed photos of her with friends or family. Her dog greeted me at the door, tail wagging but not jumping up, and we ate while talking about where we grew up. She from a quiet town in central Oregon where everyone knew each other and there wasn't much to do besides outdoor stuff like fishing or hiking, moved here for college and never left because the city had more opportunities. I told her about being from Seattle proper, growing up in a suburb south of the city with parents who still lived there and siblings who'd scattered to different states for jobs or school. After dinner, we moved to the couch with the dog squeezing in between us, put on some background show on her TV that neither of us paid much attention to, and talked more until her roommate texted that he'd be back in an hour or so. I got up to leave around 10. She walked me to the door and kissed me lightly, nothing rushed. Texts after that got more frequent but still casual. Good morning with a photo of her dog on a walk, or a link to an article about a new park opening, and I'd send back updates from my day like a funny email from a client or what Max had chewed up that morning. By the third week, things had a rhythm to them, and we spent a full weekend together starting with a hike on Saturday morning at a trail out toward Issaquah where the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that crisp fall smell mixed with pine. The dogs ran ahead on their leashes, sniffing everything, and we talked the whole way up about random things like favorite movies from when we were kids or the worst jobs we'd had in college. Hers was waitressing at a diner where the regulars tipped in change. Mine was stocking shelves at a warehouse overnight. We packed sandwiches for lunch at the top, sat on a log overlooking the valley, and on the way back she slipped her hand into mine without saying anything about it. Sunday we stayed at my place, made eggs and bacon in the morning while listening to a playlist she put on her phone, then lounged around reading and napping with the dogs on the floor. That's when she asked about my last relationship, not in a prying way, but like it came up naturally while we were talking about how hard dating apps can be. I kept it simple, said we'd been together a couple years, but realized we weren't on the same page about the future, no kids or marriage talk, but just drifting apart until it made sense to end it clean. She nodded like she got it, said her ex was someone who was always on the road for sales jobs and it wore thin after a while. No hard feelings left. That night she stayed over for the first time, and in the morning I woke to the sound of her in the kitchen grinding coffee beans. She brought me a mug in bed and it was exactly how I make it. Black with just a splash of milk, though I don't remember telling her that detail. From there it built fast. She started leaving little things at my apartment like a toothbrush in the bathroom cabinet and an extra set of clothes in a drawer I cleared out, and I did the same at her place without us really discussing it. Just happened one day when I forgot a shirt after staying over. We met each other's people casually. Her roommate over pizza one evening when he was home, a laid-back guy who worked in retail and mostly kept to his room, and she came to a casual happy hour with a few of my coworkers at a bar near the office where she fit right in, asking about their projects and remembering what everyone ordered to drink. The texts were a constant now, but in a way that felt connected rather than overwhelming at first. She'd send good morning with what she was having for breakfast. I'd reply with how Max had woken me up barking at the mailman, and throughout the day it'd be small shares like a photo of her desk setup or me complaining about a slow internet ticket I was handling. One evening I was out with some old high school friends at a dive bar downtown, told her about it ahead of time, but didn't check my phone for a couple hours because it was loud and we were catching up on stories. When I finally looked, there were 3 messages from her spaced out. Everything good? Bar too noisy to text? Give me a call when you can, just checking. I sent back that I was fine and heading home soon, and when I walked in my door she was already there sitting on the couch with the TV on low, said she'd used the key I'd given her a few days earlier to let herself in because she got off work early and wanted to wait up. She hugged me longer than usual, said she got worried when I didn't reply right away. Around the start of the second month, her questions about my plans got more detailed, not in an accusatory way at first, but like she was just interested in the logistics so we could sync up better. If I mentioned grabbing drinks with a buddy after work, she'd ask who it was, what bar, roughly what time I'd be back so she knew when to expect a text or call from me. She framed it as wanting to make sure she didn't interrupt if I was in the middle of something, which made sense on the surface. Then one day I told her I was meeting an old friend from college for coffee, a woman I'd known since freshman year but hadn't seen in ages, just to catch up on life. Sarah asked a bunch about her. How'd you meet? Was there ever anything romantic? What does she do now, married or single? And I answered casually that it was purely platonic. She'd been like a sister through school. Sarah seemed okay with it after that, but during the coffee she texted once asking how it was going, Then again a half hour later with a smile emoji and still chatting. When I got home that evening, she was already at my place again, had let herself in with the key and was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. Said she thought it'd be a nice surprise after my busy day. It was thoughtful, the food was good, but I hadn't mentioned wanting company right after, and part of me wondered why she hadn't asked if I had plans. We were spending every night together by then, switching between apartments but more often at mine because it had a yard for the dogs to run in, and her roommate didn't mind the quiet when she was gone. She'd cook dinner most evenings, had figured out exactly what I liked without me having to repeat. Pasta al dente, salads with no tomatoes because I'd mentioned once they give me heartburn, proteins grilled not fried. One weekend we took a short road trip to the coast, rented a small cabin near the beach where we could walk the dogs at low tide and build a fire in the pit outside. On the drive there, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister about family dinner plans, and Sarah glanced over and asked who it was in a casual tone. I told her. She nodded, but later when I stepped into the shower at the cabin, I left my phone on the counter, and when I came out wrapped in a towel she was holding it unlocked, said it had vibrated with another message, so she just checked quickly. It was a work notification about a system update, nothing big, but she handed it back like it was no issue. I didn't say anything then, figured it was innocent. Back in the city after that trip, things started feeling a little more constrained, like she was always one step ahead in knowing where I was or what I was doing. She suggested we turn on location sharing on our phones, said it was for safety reasons, like if one of us was running late we could see if the other was stuck in traffic or something, and it seemed practical, so I agreed without much thought. But then the texts would come if I made an unplanned stop after work, like pulling into a gas station or swinging by the grocery store for milk. She'd ask what I was getting, if I needed her to pick up anything else while she was out. One day I had a last-minute lunch with a male coworker to discuss a project glitch, told her about it that morning, and midway through eating, she called my cell asking where I was because the location showed a sandwich shop a few blocks from the office. I confirmed, said it was the coworker lunch, and she said, okay, enjoy. But that evening over dinner she brought it up again, asked why I hadn't mentioned the exact place or time earlier so she could have joined if she was free. I said it was work stuff, spontaneous, and she went quiet for the rest of the meal, picking at her food. By the third month, we were essentially living together full-time, mostly at my apartment because it had more space and a better kitchen, and she'd pretty much stopped going back to hers except to grab clothes or check mail, saying her roommate was fine with it since he liked having the place to himself sometimes. She took over a lot of the daily stuff without me asking, doing laundry and folding it exactly how I do with shirts inside out, stocking the fridge with my usual brands of yogurt and beer, even logging into my online accounts to pay a utility bill when I mentioned it was due and I was swamped at work. It felt helpful at the beginning, like having someone who cared enough to handle the small things, but then I noticed changes on my phone, like certain notifications turned off for social media apps and email alerts silenced during evenings. When I asked, she said she'd done it to help me unwind after work, less distractions so we could focus on time together. I turned them back on, said I preferred knowing if something came in, and she asked why it bothered me. Weren't the quieter nights better for us anyway? Friends started texting me separately, asking if I was all right because I hadn't responded to group plans or messages in weeks. And when I tried to make time for a guy's night or coffee with someone, she suggested alternatives like staying in for a movie or inviting them over to our place instead, so she could meet them too. If I did go out without her, the texts came in waves. First casual, like having a good time. Then more frequent, who all showed up? And let me know when you're heading home so I don't worry. One night at a bar with old friends, she showed up about an hour in, said she'd been running an errand nearby and thought it'd be fun to join since I'd mentioned the place. The guys were polite, included her in the conversation, but she stayed close the whole time, hand on my arm or knee, and we left earlier than I planned because she said she was getting tired. Later, one friend messaged me asking if she was always that attached, and I brushed it off as her being affectionate. She began going through my things more openly, opening drawers to organize and finding an old box of photos from college and exes, then sitting me down to ask about each one with women in them, wanting names, dates, reasons it ended, if I still talked to any of them on social media. It felt like being questioned, and when I said some were just friends, she pressed for details on how often we messaged or if they'd liked any recent posts of mine. I told her it was the past, but she kept bringing it up in texts days later, asking if I'd unfollowed them yet to avoid any misunderstandings. The spying got worse from there. She'd reference conversations I'd had on the phone when she wasn't in the room, like, "Sounds like your boss is being tough, overheard a bit, anything I can do?" Or know exactly what I'd bought at the store before I unpacked the bags because she'd seen the stop on location and guessed. I started turning off sharing sometimes, claiming low battery or glitch, but she'd notice within minutes and text asking why it dropped, then get silent or short in responses if I didn't flip it back on right away. She reached out to my sister on Facebook without telling me, sending a friend request and messaging about family stuff, asking what I'd said during a visit I'd taken alone, if I'd mentioned her much or seemed happy. My sister called me confused, said it felt odd, and when I asked Sarah, she said she was just trying to build connections with my family since we were serious now. She pushed for moving in officially, saying her lease was up soon and it made sense to combine everything, save money, be together more. I said, let's think on it. But she kept sending links to apartments or talking about how she'd arranged the furniture, assuming it was happening. I tried addressing it directly one night after she showed up at my gym unannounced, saying she was in the area and wanted to work out together even though I'd told her I was going alone to clear my head. I said the constant check-ins and arrivals were starting to feel heavy, like I couldn't have any time just to myself without questions or her appearing. She cried then, big silent tears, said she was sorry if it came across that way, that she just loved me so much and got anxious thinking about losing what we had, promised she'd give more space and trust me more. For about a week it improved. Texts less frequent, no surprise visits. She even encouraged me to go out with friends one night without her. But then I caught her with my phone in her hand while I was in the shower, scrolling through my contacts list, and when I grabbed it back, the screen showed she'd been in my recent texts too. She said she was looking for a number I'd mentioned earlier, but I knew that wasn't it. I told her to leave for the night, that this was crossing lines, and she begged to stay, said she'd sleep on the couch if I wanted space, that she couldn't stand being apart when things were tense. I insisted, and she left still crying, texting apologies from the car. The next day she showed up at my office building with a bagged lunch, all smiles in the lobby, said she wanted to make up for last night. Co-workers saw her waiting, thought it was sweet when she handed me the sandwich and coffee. But after she left, I checked my phone and found a new app installed, some kind of family tracker that showed real-time location and even call logs. I deleted it immediately, confronted her that evening, and she said it was just for peace of mind, in case something happened to me driving or whatever. I said no more, this was too much, and she agreed but looked hurt, like I was rejecting her care. It didn't stop though. If anything, it got more extreme. She started showing up at places I hadn't even told her about, like the dry cleaner or the park where I take Max for walks, claiming coincidence or that she'd guessed from my routine. Friends stopped reaching out as often, said it was awkward with her always texting me during hangouts or showing up halfway through, and one even told me she'd messaged him directly asking if I'd said anything negative about her or if there were women in the group. My sister called again, said Sarah had sent another message asking detailed questions about our family dynamics and if I seemed distant lately. I didn't know she'd done that, and when I asked Sarah, she said it was to feel more included, to understand me better. She installed things on my phone repeatedly. I'd delete trackers or monitoring apps, change passwords, but they'd reappear, and she'd deny it at first, then admit saying she was scared I'd drift away. I couldn't go anywhere without her wanting to tag along or blowing up my phone if I didn't, texts every 10 minutes asking for updates, photos of who was there, even calling if I didn't respond fast enough. She followed me once to a store after work, parked a block away and waited until I came out, then admitted later that she was worried I might meet someone else. The dogs started barking at odd hours, like they heard something outside the window and I'd check but see nothing, though once I swear I saw her car turning the corner. I told her last week we needed a break, that this level of control was suffocating me, making me question everything. She didn't cry this time, just sat still for a long minute, then said, okay, if that's what I need right now, but she'd be waiting because she knew we were meant to be. I changed the locks that afternoon, told her why when she came by to drop off some of my things, and she nodded like she understood but texted later asking if I was sure. Maybe we could talk it out over coffee. The texts haven't let up since. Good mornings. What are you up to? Miss you already. Are you okay? I reply short or ignore, but yesterday she emailed my work address saying she was thinking of me. suggesting lunch soon to catch up. I ignored that too. A friend said she'd reached out to him again, asking if I'd mentioned breaking up or seeing anyone new. I blocked her on social, but the phone still gets calls from unknown numbers that hang up when I answer. That tracker app popped up again somehow. I uninstalled, reset the device even. But how does she keep getting in? Borrowed a coworker's phone to look up how to wipe everything clean. But I'm stressed, keep repeating to myself it's over. She'll stop eventually. But then I see a shadow outside or hear a car slow down on the street, and I repeat, maybe she copied the key before I changed locks. Maybe she's watching right now. Stressed, repeat she'll move on. But no, deep down she won't. She loves me too much, she texts. Loves me. Repeat that. Can't sleep without checking doors, windows, apps. Loves me enough to never stop watching. I met her on Hinge in November last year, and from the very first messages, it all felt like it was moving forward without any of the usual friction that comes with meeting someone new online. Her name was Claire, she was 29, and she worked in marketing for a company that handled software for supply chains or something similar, though I never got the exact details straight in my head. Her profile pictures were straightforward, taken with a phone camera on regular days. One showed her sitting at a table in a coffee shop with a book open in front of her. Another was from a hike on a trail with trees in the background and her hair pulled back. And there was one from a bar where she was standing with a couple of friends who were laughing at something off camera. Nothing about the photos looked heavily edited or staged to impress anyone. Her prompt responses were brief and direct, the kind that suggested she had been on the app long enough to skip the performative stuff. One of them mentioned wanting someone who doesn't just stop replying after a few dates and who can sit without talking for a while without making it awkward. I sent a message commenting on the book because I had read it years earlier and remembered the title, and she responded quickly, not in a desperate way, just like she was already waiting for the conversation to start. We kept messaging back and forth over the next several days, and it never felt forced or like either of us was trying too hard to keep it going. She told me she lived by herself in a one-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, and that she liked hearing the cars and people outside at night because total silence made the place feel empty in a way she didn't enjoy. I mentioned my apartment in Fremont, how I had moved there right after the divorce 2 years earlier and still had a few boxes in the closet that I hadn't bothered to unpack because I couldn't decide if I was going to stay long-term or not. She didn't ask any follow-up questions about the marriage or why it ended, and I appreciated that she left it alone instead of turning it into a topic. By Thursday, we had moved from the app to regular texting, and we started sending each other random photos throughout the day, like the lunch she was eating at her desk or the view from my office window when the clouds were low over the water. It wasn't constant or overwhelming, just enough to make the days feel connected, and talking to her required less energy than most of the other matches I had tried before. On Friday, she asked if I wanted to meet for a drink the following evening, and I agreed without needing to think about it for long. We picked a bar in Ballard that I knew was usually quiet enough to talk, and when I arrived, she was already sitting at a small table toward the back with a glass of red wine in front of her. She looked exactly like she did in her pictures, maybe with slightly darker circles under her eyes from a long week, but it didn't make her seem tired in a bad way, just normal. We started off talking about work, complaining about open office layouts and how pointless most team-building events feel when everyone is just waiting to go home. She paid attention when I described my job, which involves pulling data and building reports for a logistics company that ships freight across the region, and she didn't change the subject or look bored even though it's not interesting to most people. After we finished our drinks there, we walked a few blocks to another spot that had booths and better lighting, ordered fries to share, and kept talking. She mentioned growing up in Spokane, moving to Seattle right after finishing college, and how she rarely went back because visits with her family always ended up stressful for reasons she didn't want to get into. I told her about growing up in Tacoma, that my parents still lived in the same house, and that I made the drive down every couple of months more out of habit than because I particularly looked forward to it. We didn't dive into anything heavy or personal, just exchanged basic facts about our lives to see how the other person responded. When the second bar started dimming the lights and stacking chairs to close, she said she had signed up for a yoga class early Sunday morning and needed to head out soon. I walked with her to where she had parked a few blocks away, and the air was cold with that light mist that hangs around in December without ever turning into proper rain. We didn't say much during the walk, just commented on how the streets were mostly empty and how the city feels different once the bars let out. When we reached her car, she gave me a quick hug and said the evening had been good, and I told her the same thing. After I got home, she sent a text saying she had made it back safely and that she enjoyed tonight, and I replied with something short agreeing. I went to sleep without overanalyzing it, just thinking that this one seemed less likely to disappear than the others had. The following week continued in the same steady way, with texts spread out through the day but not taking over my phone completely. On Sunday morning, she sent a photo of the coffee she was drinking. On Monday, I sent one of the traffic jam I was stuck in on the way to work, and by Tuesday evening, she called me out of nowhere while I was heating up leftovers for dinner. We ended up talking for more than an hour about random things, like a coworker of hers who kept scheduling unnecessary meetings, how she had started going for runs again after not bothering for almost a year, and whether adopting a cat would be a bad idea given that her job sometimes required short trips. I told her my weekend plans were basically non-existent beyond grocery shopping and maybe laundry, and she laughed at one of the stupid comments I made without making a big deal out of it. When we hung up, she said we should talk again tomorrow, and we did, picking up right where we had left off. On Thursday, she asked if I wanted to come over to her apartment for dinner the next night, saying she would cook and that I could bring a bottle of wine if I felt like it. I spent longer than necessary at the store trying to choose something decent. Her building was an older walk-up with no elevator, and the stairs made noise the whole way to the third floor. When she opened the door, she was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, with her hair tied back like she had been chopping vegetables or stirring something on the stove. The apartment was small and clearly lived in, with books piled on shelves that didn't quite fit, a few plants on the windowsill that looked like they got watered regularly, and a stack of records leaning against the wall near a turntable. The whole place smelled like garlic and tomatoes from whatever she was making. She had some quiet instrumental music playing from a speaker, nothing I recognized. We ate the pasta she had made on the couch because the kitchen table was covered with printouts and her laptop from work. We talked about recent movies we had watched alone, bands we used to listen to, and other safe topics that didn't require much risk. Later in the evening, she asked about the divorce in a way that didn't feel like prying, and I gave her the basic outline that we got married in our mid-20s, realized a few years in that we wanted different things, and split without any major fights or kids involved. She listened, and then told me about her previous relationship that had lasted 2 years and ended when the guy moved to Portland for a better job and they couldn't make the distance work. She didn't sound upset about it anymore, just matter of fact. We finished the first bottle of wine and opened the second, and at some point we ended up sitting closer on the couch. She kissed me without rushing anything, and we stopped before it went further because she said she wasn't ready for that yet, and I told her that was completely fine with me. We kept talking for a while longer about nothing important, and I left around midnight. She walked me to the door, hugged me again, and reminded me to text when I got home, which I did as soon as I walked in. Over the next few weeks, the pattern stayed consistent, with texts during the day, phone calls most evenings, and seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for coffee after work, sometimes for a movie at one of our places. Each time we hung out, it felt a little more familiar, like we were settling into a rhythm without having to discuss it. She started sending good morning texts with a photo of whatever she was looking at out her window or what she was having for breakfast, and after a while I started sending the same kind of thing back to her. It became part of the routine, and I didn't mind it taking up space in my day. Then certain small details started to stand out to me, not in a dramatic way, just things that registered after the fact. One morning she sent a message describing a dream she had, where she arrived at an important meeting without shoes and everyone was staring at her. That same night I had woken up from an almost identical dream about showing up unprepared for something at work, and when I mentioned it to her later, she said it's common for dreams to overlap when you're talking to someone a lot. It seemed reasonable. Another time I brought up in passing that I had stumbled across an old song from college that I hadn't heard in years, without naming the song or the band, and that evening she sent a short voice message humming the exact melody and saying it had come up randomly on her playlist. I figured it was just a coincidence. We started spending full weekends together, either at my apartment or hers, cooking simple meals and staying in more than going out. She came with me to meet a couple of my friends one night when we all went to a bar near my place, and I met one of her friends over coffee on a Saturday morning. Everyone seemed to get along without any awkwardness. She began mentioning events or trips that were months away, like concerts coming up in the spring or the possibility of taking a few days off to drive somewhere, and I found myself responding as if those plans already included both of us. Around that same time, I noticed that I hadn't checked in with certain people in longer than usual. My sister and I normally exchange messages every week or so, but a couple of weeks had gone by without either of us reaching out. The same thing happened with a few friends I used to text regularly. I told myself it was because I had been busy with this new relationship and that it wasn't a big deal. One evening in January, we were at her apartment, sitting on the bed with her laptop propped up playing some show neither of us was paying close attention to. She paused it to go get water from the kitchen, and when she came back she handed me a glass that wasn't too cold, exactly the temperature I always let tap water sit to before drinking it. She seemed to get those kinds of preferences right without me ever pointing them out. I thanked her. She nodded, and we kept watching. A week or so later, I had a frustrating day at work when a project I had spent a lot of time on got canceled without warning by someone higher up. I sent her a couple of messages complaining about it while driving home, and as soon as I got inside my apartment, she called. She let me talk through the whole thing without interrupting much, and when I was done, she said the usual things about how it wasn't my fault and that another opportunity would come up soon. Then she added that if I wanted to come over, she had made the tomato soup I had mentioned liking a few weeks earlier. I hadn't said anything about being hungry or wanting soup that day, but I drove over anyway. On the way there, I kept thinking about how quickly she seemed to know what would help on a bad day, and while it was convenient and made me feel taken care of, it also started to feel like I rarely had to ask for anything anymore. When I arrived, she opened the door, took my coat, and had 2 bowls of soup already on the coffee table with spoons waiting. We ate while I went over the work situation again, and she asked specific questions about details I hadn't brought up yet, like whether my manager had given any explanation or what the next assignment might be. I realized I hadn't thought to ask those things myself, but probably should have. After we finished eating, we cleaned up the dishes together and went to bed earlier than usual because I was worn out. She fell asleep within minutes, and I lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time, unable to shut my brain off. The next morning, I woke up before her and watched her face while she was still sleeping, trying to figure out why something felt off even though everything looked exactly the same as always. Nothing about her appearance had changed, but I had a tight feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. That day at work, I sent fewer messages than usual, and when she texted to ask if everything was okay, I told her I was just caught up in deadlines. She didn't press for more. That night, I stayed at my own apartment and told her I needed to catch up on sleep. She replied that it was no problem and to let her know when I felt like hanging out again. I didn't sleep much better there either, and I kept running through the past couple of months in my head, noticing how quickly my schedule had rearranged itself around her without me making any conscious decisions about it. The following day, she called during my lunch break, and I let it go to voicemail. She sent a short text afterward just asking how my day was going, and I waited several hours before replying with something brief. By Friday, she asked if I had plans for the weekend, and I said I was going to meet up with some friends I hadn't seen in a while, which was only partly true at that point. She said that sounded good, and to have fun. On Saturday, I actually did reach out to a couple of guys I used to hang out with more often, and we met for beers at a place we always went to before. We talked about work and mutual friends and whatever else came up, and when they asked about the person I was seeing, I said things were going fine but didn't go into much detail. One of them pointed out that I seemed quieter than I used to be, and I told him I was probably just tired from the week. Sunday morning, she sent a message saying she missed me and asked if I wanted to get dinner that night. I read it several times before answering that I had a bunch of errands and chores to catch up on, and maybe we could do something next week instead. She replied right away saying that was okay, and to let her know when I was free. Monday came and there was no good morning text from her for the first time in weeks, and I felt a mix of relief and guilt about it. That evening she called again, and this time I picked up. She asked how the weekend had gone, and I kept my answers short and vague. After a pause, she asked directly if everything was all right between us, and I said yes, but that I had been feeling like I needed some space to deal with my own stuff. She said she understood completely and that she had gone through the same thing in past relationships. We talked for a little longer about nothing important and ended the call on a neutral note. Over the next few days, the messaging slowed down noticeably, and we weren't on the phone every night anymore, I started texting my sister again and reached out to a few other people I had let slide, and it felt like my contacts list was opening back up after being narrowed for a while. On Thursday, she asked if I wanted to meet for coffee after work, and I said yes because it seemed harmless. We went to the same cafe we had used early on, and she looked basically the same, maybe like she had lost a couple of pounds, but nothing drastic. We talked about surface-level things like how busy work had been for both of us and what the weather was supposed to do over the weekend. When the conversation hit a lull, she said she had been thinking about me a lot and hoped I was doing okay. I nodded and didn't say much in response. She reached over and touched my hand lightly and said that if I needed more space, she was fine with that, but asked me not to just stop replying altogether. I told her I wouldn't do that. We hugged outside the cafe when we left, and later that evening, she sent a text saying it had been good to see me in person. I replied that it had been good to see her too. Friday and Saturday passed without any messages from her, and by Sunday I started second-guessing whether I had made too much out of everything and if I should be the one to reach out first. I didn't end up doing it. Monday evening, there was a knock at my apartment door when I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Claire was standing there holding a plastic bag with takeout containers inside. She gave a small, unsure smile and said she had been in the neighborhood and picked up food from the Thai place I always order from. I stepped aside and let her come in. We ate on the couch while some random show played in the background that neither of us paid attention to. The conversation stayed careful, like we were both avoiding certain topics. After we finished eating, she said she had missed spending time like this, and I admitted that I had too. She ended up staying the night. The next morning, she got up and made coffee while I was in the shower, and when I came out, it was exactly the right strength with the right amount of milk. We left the building at the same time and kissed quickly in the hallway before heading to work. After that evening, things slipped back into the previous routine almost without discussion, with texts throughout the day again and plans for most weekends. The uncomfortable feeling I had been carrying around eased up, and I convinced myself that I had just needed a short break to reset. The months went by like that, February turning into March, and then April. She bought tickets for a concert I had mentioned wanting to go to, and when my parents came up for a weekend, she met them and everyone got along fine. We started talking about possible plans for the summer, like renting a house on the coast for a long weekend if we could both get the time off. One night in April, we were at my apartment lying in bed when she said out of nowhere that sometimes it felt like she could tell what I was going to say right before I said it. I asked what she meant by that, and she said it was just that we seemed to be on the same wavelength a lot. I agreed that it did feel that way sometimes. A few days later, we were at her place assembling a bookshelf she had ordered online that came in a million pieces. We had music playing quietly from her phone, and whenever I needed a particular screw or bracket, she handed it over before I asked for it. I thanked her each time, and she just kept holding the shelf steady while I worked. That night, I had trouble falling asleep again and ended up getting out of bed to sit in the living room in the dark. I opened my phone and scrolled back through months of our text conversations, and the more I read, the more I noticed patterns I hadn't paid attention to before. She would ask questions that gently steered things towards subjects I later realized I had been wanting to talk about but hadn't brought up myself. She suggested places to eat or things to do that matched ideas I had been considering privately. It wasn't obvious or aggressive, just consistent enough to keep everything moving smoothly. I opened her Instagram account, which I hadn't looked at in weeks, and went back through older posts from before we met. Her hair used to be longer, her clothes had more color and pattern, and she posted more often with groups of friends. Over the months since we started dating, the photos had gradually become fewer and farther between, the vibrant group shots from parties or weekend trips replaced by solitary images. Her alone on a trail with no one else in frame, a close-up of her coffee mug on a windowsill, or just blurred city lights at night with captions that grew shorter until there were none at all. The comments from friends tapered off too, starting with playful questions about where she'd disappeared to, then trailing into nothing, as if her circle had quietly accepted the distance or stopped trying to bridge it. It wasn't dramatic, no big announcements or cryptic posts, just a slow fading that mirrored how my own feed had changed without me noticing at the time. My pictures shifting from nights out with friends to quiet evenings in, often with her hand or shoulder just out of frame. Sitting there in the dark living room that night, phone in hand while she slept down the hall, I felt a chill settle in that had nothing to do with the temperature. All those small conveniences, the way she always knew what I needed before I asked, the shared dreams, the perfectly timed suggestions, started to feel less like deep compatibility and more like an erosion, as if my preferences and routines were being absorbed rather than matched. I thought about how long it had been since I'd made a plan without considering her schedule first, how my contacts list had narrowed to mostly her name lighting up the screen, and the realization sat heavy. This relationship hadn't just filled the empty spaces in my life, it had quietly expanded to occupy them all. The next morning I left before she woke up, texting a vague excuse about an early meeting, and spent the day at work with my phone on silent. When she messaged asking if everything was okay, I replied hours later saying I needed some time to think things through. She responded that she understood, no pressure, just to reach out when I was ready. The days after that stretched into weeks of deliberate distance, no calls, minimal texts, and she never pushed, just adjusted to the space like she always did. My life started filling back in on its own, drinks with old friends, calls with my sister, weekends that belonged only to me again. It's been almost a year now since that night on her couch, and I still don't have a clear answer about what exactly happened. Sometimes I convince myself it was just an intense connection that moved too fast, the kind where two lonely people latch on and blur together for a while. Other times, in quieter moments, I wonder if something more subtle was at play, a slow, seamless merging until individuality starts to feel optional. I never reached out again, and she didn't either. Her Instagram stopped updating entirely a few months later, the account still there but frozen on that last rainy window shot. If you're meeting someone and it starts feeling perfectly attuned from the beginning, just pause now and then to check what parts of your own life are still unmistakably yours. Sometimes the most comfortable fit is the one that reshapes you without you ever noticing the seams.